Dr. Les Roberts from New York. Also from Bristol by the prominent anti-war campaigner, the Labour MP John McDonnell. While in Washington we have David Frum, the former speechwriter for President Bush. Tonight we asked, first of all, Dr. Roberts, the shocking thing is that these figures are so massively different, as Paul Mason explained, from any estimates we have. Is it possible, you make your explanation through what Paul Mason said, a political lens of the people that you spoke to in those households?
No, that's actually not a possibility. And there was something sort of missing from the intro piece, and that was, we knocked on doors. We said, who lived here in the beginning of 2002? Who lives here today? We asked, had anyone been born or died in between? And in those houses that reported a death, we'd usually ask, by the way, can you give us the death certificate? We'd ask that at the end of the interview. And in Iraq, it is very unusual for a stranger to knock on your door. And 92% of the time, people would come up with death certificates, and it's just not plausible that they would have forged fake death certificates in advance.
Well, your last report, when your last report appeared in the Lancet, of course, it too was rubbished by both the Iraqis and the American government, just as this one has been.
But not by any researchers who measured deaths in times of war in the past. And you know, there's probably 20 people out there with this experience, and none of them are saying that this is wrong. In fact, the U.S. government spends millions and millions of dollars every year to train people how to do these cluster surveys in natural disasters and wars in order to acquire mortality data. This is the U.S. government's approach. This is what the U.S. government did in Kosovo and Afghanistan and elsewhere. It's the standard approach. And as one of your introductory people said, 2% of people dying is pretty easy to confirm.
Well, David,
it'll be very easy for you to go out and confirm this.
Well, David Frum, as Les Roberts says, this is an approved government method. What do you make of the figures?
Well, you can still make a mistake with an approved method. For example, you can oversample in areas of great violence. One of the things that was missing from your package was a proper identification of Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institute, who disputed the report. Michael O'Hanlon is the author of a monthly report published online called the Iraq Index that gathers all the statistical information available from Iraq. He is the preeminent authority on Iraq, on statistics on the Iraq War in every area, from casualties to economics. If he is telling you that this method is not, either the method is flawed or else the data plugged into the method, because even if you have an excellent method, as the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out, if you've oversampled from areas of violence and undersampled from other areas, you can produce a nonsensical result, as everyone, for example, who watched the exit polls after the recent American presidential elections has seen on their own television sets.
Dr. Roberts, what do you say to that?
I think, yeah, that's a good point, but think about the exit poll issues. They're just shifting things a couple percent. So as Mr. Frum mentioned, it's conceivable that a couple million people have moved around in Iraq from high mortality areas to low mortality areas or vice versa. That wouldn't change these results by 10%. That can't explain virtually any of this. And as far as Mr. O'Hanlon's report, it is a passive surveillance system. And we have searched and searched and searched and asked experts. Only in Bosnia can we find any example where monitoring morgues or hospitals or newspapers could come up with 20% of deaths. And most importantly, in the last year of Saddam's reign, all governmental monitoring schemes, morgues, plus hospitals, plus death certificates that were eventually turned in, only accounted for about a third of all deaths in the country.
Right, I'd like to bring in our Bristol guest now. John McDonnell, as a prominent anti-war campaigner, do you feel vindicated in one horrible way by what you hear in Les Roberts' report?
I don't want to look on it that way. This is a real tragedy. Even if the figure's 100% out, it still means over 300,000 people have lost their lives as a result of this war, which was, I think, a terrible mistake. What we need to do now is talk about an exit strategy and have that political debate. What's worrying me is that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and others are just not talking about where we go from here. They seem to be without any form of strategy for the future. We need to recognise that large numbers of people have lost their lives. We've got to do something to prevent further loss of life. And I think the exit strategy for Britain and the US now has to be to admit we've made a mistake. we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem, and that we need to go back to the United Nations now and appeal to the world to assist us in the withdrawal. We need to set a deadline for withdrawal and appeal to the rest of the world through the United Nations to help us solve this problem.
Well, David, just say for a moment that this figure is a probable figure. I mean, does that make any difference?
Well, it makes this enormous difference. I think this is one of the things that really is most flawed about this, is whether the number is 60,000 or whether it's a bigger, as most authorities say, or whether it's a bigger number. The suggestion that this report in some way condemns what Britain and the United States have done, when Britain and the United States are in combat against the people, inflicting the car bombings.
On this point of statistics, let's stick with this for a moment. Is there a level, you said it doesn't really matter, but is there a level of deaths, violent deaths, which would be unacceptable?
Let me ask you this. Is there a level?
No, could you answer me if you answer that?
I'm going to rephrase your question, and I think the answer is obvious. What you're saying is there a level of killing at which the killers should be allowed to get away with their killing? If the killers in Iraq, if the insurgents, if the people detonating the car bombs, if the people firing these guns, if they kill enough Iraqis, does there come a point where we should let them have the country? And I think to ask that question is to answer it. The more these insurgents kill, the more important it is to defeat them, the more dangerous they expose themselves as, and the more reckless it would seem to abandon 20 million people to them.
Dr. Roberts, first of all, tell me, what do you think about being so roundly condemned by the President today?
I think it was expected. I'm not at all surprised. And I think what's really unfortunate, was missing from the last comment, is, I'm not in a position to make a particular strategy as a response, but I am quite capable of saying if 600,000 people have died, it's really important we in the West use a tone of contrition rather than a tone of belligerence. I think in terms of our long-term global security, being able to say, wow, we are really sorry about all the suffering that goes on there, is one message, and saying, oh, we don't even think it's a tenth as high as it's really been, is quite the opposite message, not just to Iraqis, but to all their neighbors as well.
Thank you all very much. Tomorrow morning's front pages, beginning with The Independent on that figure from the John Hopkins story, 655,000, the toll of war in Iraq. Moving on to The Guardian, their line is 1 in 50 Iraqis killed since the invasion. It's the clot's fault, but which one? England blame game begins after 2-0 defeat. And, of course, Scotland went down 2-0 to the Ukraine as well. The Daily no, not again. That plane piloted, we think, by a basketball star, which crashed into Manhattan tonight. Now, on the Daily Mirror, we're going to come back to this story about sex swap Jacko. You'll never guess who this is. And moving on to page 4 and 5 of that story, on The Sun, Michael Jackson dressed up as a woman with tight jeans on, high heels, a floppy hat.